You're listening to the Future is Bilingual podcast. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the episode. Welcome to the Future is Bilingual podcast. I'm Heather.
And I'm Marcin.
And we're here to talk about all things related to language, learning, and teaching.
We have different backgrounds, but we both speak multiple languages and continue to learn more.
I have 2 young children whom I'm raising bilingually, and I know it's going to get harder when they enter school. I started this podcast because I want to hear from other families who've successfully raised their children in more than one language.
And I grew up in Poland and moved to the US when I was 13. Now I'm a children's librarian who works with a lot of kids and their parents, finding ways to meet their literature and bilingual needs, no matter what part of the world they come from.
We also hope to use this platform as a way to promote bilingual education and multiple cultural identities. We want to normalize immigrant experiences and multilingual environments.
We will bring you in-depth discussions on topics related to language acquisition and maintenance, as well as interviews with multilingual speakers from around the world.
We hope you really enjoy the podcast and learn something new about bilingualism with every episode. Today, we're going to talk about language attrition, which you may or may not have heard about already. But I did say that I had a surprise for you guys. This is the first episode of season 2, and I would like to welcome my co-host, Marcin. Welcome.
Hello, welcome, and thank you. I'm excited to try this very new experience for me as a co-host. And some of you may have heard me already talking with Heather about a little bit more about my life. So if you're interested in that, you can listen to that. But I've been learning languages for a long, long time, and I started with Russian and then English and then German and French and a little bit of, Norwegian, Danish, Spanish, French, in Italian, in very small amounts, but all very fun.
Excellent. And if you can't tell, because he has an amazing accent, Marcin is from Poland, so he's a native Polish speaker. And if, like he said, if you haven't heard his story, you can go back and listen to the previous episodes. So I thought it would be nice to have another voice on the podcast, not just my own, and especially someone who has all the experience, as you just heard, that he has learning languages, being a multilingual, plurilingual speaker. So we're going to talk today about language attrition. We want to start with some definitions. Then we're going to get into some of the reasons that this might happen, along with some personal anecdotes, not our own, but from other people as well. And then finally, we want to end with what you can do to kind of prevent this from happening. So if we are bilingual, multilingual, most of us would like to keep our level and not lose and drop to a lower level. So we're going to end kind of on a positive, what we can do. All right, so you want to start with the first definition?
Yeah, so we have a few definitions that kind of describe it. Well, actually, I want to start with my favorite because languages is like riding a bike. You don't lose it, but you get a bit wobbly. So what that means is that you gradually reduce or lose your linguistic knowledge and skills over time. And that is probably a good way to start it. So it's a reduction and a weakening or loss of a language, and we will be focusing on first language, but that can happen to any of your languages, and I can sure say a lot about that in terms of the smaller languages you study. You learn language for a few months, and then a year later you realize there's very little left.
Oh, yeah, it's so frustrating. I've had that happen with many languages when you don't have such a strong grasp on them, and you feel like you've studied a lot, but time goes by and then they're gone, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So yeah, a definition of language attrition that I like is that you are, reduction, weakening, like you said, but just forgetting. So if we don't use it, people say this a lot, if you don't use it, you lose it. So forgetting of a native language, but it could also be the second, third, fourth, like Marcin said. And just, focusing on the skills and knowledge. So I know a lot of times with me, it's been words. So that concrete knowledge that I can't come up with the word, but I have it in another language. But also the skills. So maybe your writing's gotten weaker or
Yeah.
speaking, things like that.
Yeah.
And that definition was from Ung Sung Park from 2018, the gradual reduction or loss of linguistic knowledge and skills. And he specifically says in an individual, or she, I'm sorry. So I think that's really important that we're talking about individuals. We're not talking about a community losing a language, but just one person.
Yes, I mean that can be an episode all to itself, with communities losing
Mm-hmm.
language, but even with how languages evolve over time. We all know this whenever we're watching an old movie. Um,
Yeah.
it's always interesting to hear how we've changed the way we speak on
That's
a
very
human
true.
level.
Yeah, it's so true. I didn't think about that before, but you're right. Watching something from the 1960s, it's like a whole nother world.
Yeah, and it happens in every language, that at least in every language that I have had experience with, and I see no reason why it would be different in other languages.
Mm-hmm.
From one generation to the next, things change. Uh, and you listen to teens, and it's hard to understand them sometimes because they have their own lingo. And
Yes.
we were like that not too long ago, and now it's the next generation. But
That
attrition
is so
is,
true.
yeah, but attrition is slightly different than that. But it's a concept that I think even if you haven't heard the term, like it's a concept you are more or less familiar with,
Mhm.
probably.
Yes, for sure. And we'll give you some more examples. So if you're still not completely sure what we're talking about, we'll give you some very concrete examples from ourselves and people that we know. So some of the reasons or factors why this might happen, probably one of the first ones that comes to mind is that you emigrate or you leave your country to go live in another country.
Yes,
So
that is the
this, I
point.
mean, is like one of the most well known because you just kind of cut off the contact with that language unless you have a community around you, or you make a big effort to kind of keep in contact with that country.
Yeah, and it's hard even if you are, in contact with some of the language, like just the sheer immersion, will can overwhelm you. That's basically what happened to me, when I moved.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I moved early enough that I was, not completely fluent, but late enough that I don't think the language I was ever at a there was ever a chance that I would completely lose the language, and especially since we kept it at home. We kept,
Mm-hmm.
spoke Polish at home. But as years went by, and I got to be about 18, 19, about 5, 6, 7 years after emigrating, I realized how poor my Polish had gotten. So then I had to make an effort to bolster it again.
Mm-hmm. And
And
we do have some research about this that, so I'm quoting here. Once past puberty, Dr. Schmidt says your first language is stable and the effects of attrition can reverse themselves if you are reimmersed. And I want to put another if on that.
yeah,
That's from an article on bbc.com. I feel like if you make the effort, so maybe being immersed would be enough. Like if you moved back to your original country,
yeah,
um, that would be probably enough. But since you didn't, you stayed in the US, you had to make a concerted effort to really re-immerse yourself in all the other times of the day that you could. So I feel like living with your parents, there's a very specific way of speaking at home, not specific, but like
mhm,
it's not the 100% of an experience that you would have if you worked and commuted and watched TV and listened to all radio. If you're completely immersed, it's so much more than just speaking with your parents.
yeah.
And I feel like that's where, even with me learning Polish, I kind of learned the same way that you were living here. Like I just learned in the house with my husband's family. And it isn't the full, I don't feel like I learned the full language that way. You
No,
do have to add additional
one
things
thing
to it.
I one thing that I noticed about that is that when I was, I've noticed that, for example, my Polish was very strong when it came to, as you say, like things around the house. So I was very good with names of everything around the house and all the household items and everything in the kitchen, all the utensils and all the
Hmm.
different like instruments you might use there. But then when I was trying to translate those to English, if I needed to talk to someone about that, I realized that I was lacking those skills because I never had to use
Hmm.
that lingo in an English environment for a very long time. So that was, to me, that was an
Hmm.
interesting realization that there are certain pockets of certain areas where I was able to speak English fluently, like in the
Hmm.
in school, like what we were talking about in school, and then even in the academia later when I was in college, I was able to communicate there very fluently. But if we were to when if we were to like talk about much more mundane things, then I was missing words,
Yeah.
even though I was so fluent in an academic sense.
And I do feel like as a teacher, I've seen like there's always a unit on the house and, that kind of like chores and all that sort of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. I guess
But
don't skip it over.
they try, like, I feel like we try and teach it to the students, but it's not the same. It's not the same to study it for a week or two as it is to have your mom telling you every weekend, like, go clean your room,
Yeah,
mop the floor.
yeah,
I just feel like it's not as much repetition, and I feel like students are bored by it because they don't want to talk about chores and spatulas and household items. Not
yeah,
even spatula. I feel like spatula is never on there. Like all those important utensils aren't even in the book. It's more
yeah,
just like chores, and
yeah.
those are
And
those words that you don't know if you
yeah,
like. When I just studied French and I would go to France, I didn't know the word for whisk and spatula,
hmm,
and they give you the basics like a pan, but
yeah. The big one for me was also bed sheets. When I wanted to buy new bed sheets, I
oh,
realized I had no idea what any of it is called.
hmm,
Um, and then so it was a very strange experience buying bed sheets when I was like when I moved out and I had to get all new
yeah,
things.
you're a full-fledged adult and you're like, how do I say these things?
Yes, yeah, I
But I
know
feel that way.
Poland. Other than that, what is everything else?
Hmm. Yeah,
Mm.
for some reason I can't remember those in Polish. I keep looking them up and they don't stick with me for some reason. So it's the same problem,
Yes,
just
and
reversed.
yeah, right.
And I think you had a story. You have a friend, Michael. Do you
I
want to tell us about him?
Yeah, Michael is he's a great guy. If you have a chance to meet him, you definitely should. It might be difficult unless you live in Korea at the moment because that's where he is.
Oh,
He was born and grew up in Brazil. So obviously he learned Portuguese, first. That was his first native language. And he lived there until he was about 18 or so, at which time he moved to the US. And at first he was in the Boston area in Massachusetts. So he was and there were at that time a lot of Brazilian immigrants. So he was able to, improve his English and learn English and keep his Portuguese. After a while, he moved to Western Mass, so there were probably less Portuguese speakers that he was around. But
mm-hmm.
many years later, when he was about 35 or so, he moved to Korea. And at that point, he became pretty much completely cut off from Portuguese speakers, um, and obviously he had to really try hard to learn Korean at that time because he learned a little bit when he was in the U.S., but not too much.
Mm-hmm.
But a few years later, he started streaming on Twitch. If anybody is familiar, like it's a gaming streaming platform, so you can watch him play games. But
Mm-hmm.
as he started it, he decided to include all his languages. So he said, like, hey, if you speak Portuguese and if you speak English and if you speak Korean, stop by. So people
Ah.
from Brazil would find him and they would start speaking to him, and he realized how much he lost of the language. And
So
he was
wait,
trying
I
to,
have to
yeah,
stop you because I don't know what Twitch is.
oh,
Is he playing a game and chatting? Is it like
yes, yeah.
that
So
kind of
you can
interactive?
see, yes. So you can
Okay.
see his computer screen. It's part of your screen will be the game he's playing, and then there's a
Okay.
camera of him, so you can see him, and there's a chat component, so you can write, and then he can talk back to you and answer and have
Are
a
you
chat. and he's playing.
Okay, but are you playing with him or just watching
Mostly
as
just
he?
watching. Yeah,
Okay.
that's the generally the platform is made that way, but there are, streamers, and he's one of them that they do um, times where you can play with him and you join a game.
Hmm.
But yeah, most people are there to watch other people play. And
Huh.
so he was finding all these Brazilians were finding him and talking to him, and they were, probably excited to talk with him. And he realized how hard he had to work to answer their questions. Um,
Oh.
and, he, and with time, it started getting better. And he compared it to a zip file on a computer where um, your computer can take, a lot of information and kind of zip it up into a smaller bit and put it away for
Hmm.
later. And when it needs it, it unpacks it. And that's what he feels like his brain was doing. It was unpacking all that information that was stored unused for so long. And it was taking a while for that to get decoded so he could start using it
Hmm.
again. Um, so it
This is
was,
the most, uh, what I want to say, like computer tech savvy this podcast has ever gotten. But yes.
and it's probably one of the more tech-oriented explanations of
Hmm.
linguistic terminology around.
Well,
Yeah,
Michael's into that world, so he's given you this comparison. But I think it is a good comparison. I don't know if everybody knows zip files. I almost never use them. But yeah, I get the idea that you've kind of stored it away
yeah, you pack
until
it
later.
away.
And it must be such a weird feeling. And I've had it a little bit, but not to this extent where you feel like you don't speak your native language
Mhm.
up to par. Like I only spent 2 years in France, and I came home feeling that way a little bit, um, and just feeling that my accent had changed, like the way I spoke changed. I
Yeah,
don't know, just the whole thought process, everything. And that
yeah.
was a short, relatively short period of time. So
When I
I can
visit
only
Poland,
imagine.
I get that. Yeah, I get that when I visit Poland. Say like, "Oh, you have an American accent," and depending on the day, you'll hear me and you'll say, oh, "Okay, you have a slight Polish accent," and but apparently, um, I do no matter what language I'm speaking.
Hmm.
And that can be interesting. And um, yeah, and with me, it's usually individual words that I can't remember. But I never have an issue with expressing, larger ideas. It's individual words that are escaping. So it's
Hmm.
that of, well, and I guess it's our next reason and factor. It's a lack of contact with the language, which can lead to lexical gaps and missing vocabulary. And I've
Exactly.
used that a little bit. And actually Michael was talking about it as well and in his explanation of how he feels about it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is why. So, as you all know, Marcin and I both speak Polish, and we joke often about the American Polish community has all these English words that have been Polonized. I don't know if I can say that, but made to sound like a Polish word. Um, and it just happens because, like, oh, this I can't think of this word. I'm just going to say this word.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's many examples, and I'm sure that's not a unique thing to this community. I'm sure many communities will do that, but
Yeah. And I always wondered because I've noticed that it's often verbs and nouns. It never seems to be adjectives or adverbs that are
mm,
getting treatment. And I wonder how
yeah.
that or that, how similar that is in other languages that do similar things.
So to be continued. We will do some research on that because it is fascinating. So maybe that'll be a future episode.
That would be
I did receive an email from a follower on Facebook.
Hi guys, sorry. Quick correction. These is a follower on Instagram, not Facebook. Thanks.
And I thank her very much. Elise sent me an email, and she did say that I could share some of it. So I won't read the whole thing, but she's French and she's lived in the U.S. for 11 years. And her husband is American and didn't really speak French when they first met. So she just mentioned how her whole goal, her whole purpose when she first moved was that she wanted to be, speak English as well as she could. So she says that she wanted to know all the phrases, be able to make jokes. So she really wanted to be proficient. And she isolated herself into this, she calls it an English bubble. So everything she did, her TV, radio, books, work, talking with her husband, talking with friends. She did everything in English, and she didn't really realize, but she was starting to lose her French. And then she would call her family like once a week, and then they started commenting that, that's not the right word. Oh, just little things that it was becoming noticeable that her French was getting worse and worse. So it is a slow process. So many of us might not notice it happening, but at a certain point, she did say that there was specific points where she did notice. Like you were saying, specific words wouldn't come. But I think what really stuck out about her email was the emotion, because she mentions it was embarrassing. She felt sad, frustrated, shameful, and these aren't things that we can really talk about. Like if our family is all, like she left France, if her whole family's back there and they're all monolingual, they're not really going to understand her if she wants to talk about this. And, on the other side, her husband's here, he's American, he's maybe monolingual, maybe speaks a little bit of French, she was mentioning, but, she doesn't really have someone that's going to understand exactly what she was feeling and going through at that time. She did mention, though, that she has a few kids now, and she worked really hard herself to get French back into her life, because when she started to speak to her daughter, she noticed her like vocabulary was kind of limited. So, and she was like, oh, I need to do something. So she proactively took all these actions. So she stopped reading in English. She only read in French. She was reading, watching TV, reading, doing everything she could, listening to French podcasts, doing, even getting back into like French humor, because it's different. Every culture has their own sense of humor. The pop cultural references, all that stuff. Like my husband and I talk about it, how we don't know the politicians back in Poland. Like listening to the Polish news doesn't really mean that much to us, because we're so focused on our politics.
Right.
Because they're more pertinent, they're more, in our face right now.
You are here.
But she does, end well that her 7-year-old, her daughter's now 7, she is a huge chatterbox, she said, in both English and French. She has a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. And so she's raising them bilingually. She does mention how her husband supports them and his French has gotten better. And I was just so touched by her email. So we've had a little back and forth, but I think it's really important to talk about how much emotion can go into this, and shame. If this is something that you're struggling with, you're not alone. There's definitely other people that are going through this, and it's not something we really talk about. It might be something that we feel is happening, and then we try and avoid it. We don't want to talk about it. And I mean, there's other things we're going to talk about, stigmas, like if you're an immigrant. I know you're going to talk more about this, but just the desire to assimilate, which is what she mentioned. She really wanted to just immerse herself into this American culture and fit in with all of, her husband and their friends. When she has kids, all the school parents. So there is a lot of pressure to just assimilate, and you can only do so much. There's only so many hours in a day.
And sometimes I think maybe among monolinguals, there is that idea that immigrants don't want to assimilate or learn the language, and that is by and large false. Virtually everybody wants to learn the language, and they want to, fit in, but also just want to be able to communicate and live a normal life. And but there are these different forces, and the shame is like, or the shame or negative feelings of losing a language are very strong. That is, after all, where you come from, and that is such an important part of people's identities. So these different forces are at they have a little bit of tug of war with each other, but it's never that people don't want to learn the language of the country they've come to live in.
Right. We see people at their different stages, and if they're at their a low point in the language, like they haven't learned a lot yet, then we judge them like, oh, they're not making an effort. And it's like, well, no, they just came here a few months ago, or whatever, or they have a big community of people who speak their language, and they haven't had the need yet to really.
And they might also have the economic disadvantages where they have to work
Right.
So say they have to work a couple different jobs to make ends meet, and at the end of the day, you're exhausted. You don't have the mental capacity to learn and study the language and pick it up
Right.
more.
Or even know where to. And I know lots of libraries will offer free courses, but maybe they're working during that time. And maybe they
Yeah.
just don't even know about it. So I taught ESL at a library, and I feel like getting the message out was such a big struggle too. Like, we had a small group, but I feel like there were so many more people that we could have been reaching, and
Yeah.
they couldn't come for whatever reason. But yeah, you don't know.
Yeah. And the
Um,
library that I work at as well, we have an ELL center where people who have come from other countries do get they can come in for conversation circles, and they have one-on-one tutors. Um,
mhm,
and it's an incredible work, and it's I mean, run by a person that works at the library, but the vast majority of the work, like all the people who basically do it are volunteers. They volunteer their time to be
mhm,
one for an hour, a couple hours a week with an immigrant and helping them acquire the language. And it's an incredible work, um, but it's hard if you don't have if your hours are limited,
right.
because you've moved here and you're trying to make ends meet and assimilate. It's not easy.
Mhm. Okay, I have another question for you. What
Yeah.
about perceived language prestige?
Yeah, that one, it's a very subjective thing, but it's very real, where people consider some languages to be more important and more prestigious than others. And English comes, pretty much at the top of that hierarchy through historical
Mhm,
reasons. But it's become a pretty much the universal language in the world. So people naturally will be drawn to it. And if you come from another country that is not very high up on that in that perceived hierarchy of languages,
mhm,
then it's much harder to keep that. And in
mhm,
terms of you know there was a family, I was reading an article about a family of German Americans who had there were three siblings, and the mother was German and the father was Polish, and they moved to the US, and the father was a huge proponent of German speaking at home, and he made sure all his kids learned German and they spoke German at home. And the
mhm.
article didn't mention why German and not Polish, but it seems that perhaps there was some of that conscious or unconscious hierarchy
Bias.
going on there. Yeah.
Mhm,
Um, and there are very specific historical reasons why German Poles and Polish Germans might choose one language over another as well. But
mhm.
language seems to be one of the reasons for that.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about it, how we, even in the US, like we only kind of teach certain languages. So Spanish, French, second, maybe some German.
Yes.
Um, but I mean, we're just kind of in that cycle of like, well, these are the top languages in Europe, French, and then German for the EU, and then Spanish just for the number of speakers and the proximity that we have to Central and South America.
Mm.
And I feel like it's like a vicious cycle because we don't offer, let's say, less prestigious or like less commonly spoken or less well-known languages, and then they become less well-known because nobody's studying them.
Right.
And even though we have like a huge Vietnamese population in our area,
Hmm.
that's never been a language that's been offered.
Right.
Um, it, it's just that's yeah, it's a shame, but it is very real, and it's going to change, depending on
Mhm.
where you're living, the different situation. But I do think, yeah, English is a lingua franca right now, which it's just the language used everywhere. Um, and I just had an interview on a Polish podcast, and she kind of playing devil's advocate asked me, why teach your kids Polish? Because you're in America, you're an English speaker. English is so much more important than Polish, and that is an argument that people would make. So she was kind of just playing devil's advocate to see what I would say, but that is a real thought that a lot of people have. Totally disregarding all the benefits of being bilingual, disregarding the fact that that's half of my family's, my husband's whole side is Polish. It's like,
Yeah, which is important. But also there
right.
are, on an upside of that, if you speak a language that is less popular, that might still get you career opportunities. And we have a couple of friends who were able to, their job paid for them to go to Poland. You interviewed one of them, but we have at least one more who went to Poland, actually not too far from his birthplace, and spent a few months there that his company paid for just because he was able to speak the language. So even if it's a prestigious language, that doesn't mean that it wouldn't lead to opportunity in the future.
Serve you.
Yeah.
And I also feel like the more languages you know, the easier it is to learn the next one. And, that might not be the end of the story for you. If you speak these 2 languages, maybe that's going to help you learn a third one, which is going to help you land that job. So it's not the end all be all. But yeah, we could talk at length about this. So let's see, the path of least resistance. We both know this very well. And we kind of mentioned this, how, one word will come in English, even if you're speaking Polish. And for me, that happens all the time.
Yeah, it's very easy for that to happen. And and there are many reasons for that. One is that, it's the path of least resistance. It's the easier thing to do, but also, at the end of the day, you might be, you're tired and your brain is exhausted, and it's not as easy to then try very hard to think in a second language, and also, especially if it happens a lot, at some point that exhaustion will kick in, and we do that a lot, and which is probably why there are so many Polonized English words, and same with other languages, that happens as well. It's just so easy.
And if you work all day, you're spending your whole day in a certain language. It is hard to have to literally translate all these different words, because they might not be things that you were in contact with in your native tongue. These might be new things that you might be able to learn the word for, but you learned it over here in your second language.
You want to tell a story of what happened to you during the day, but that story took place in one language, and then at the end of the day, you're trying to communicate that to someone in another language. It's easier, especially if both of you speak the other, both languages. It's easy to slip back and
And I think this happens a lot with kids. So once they go to school, they're speaking the majority language, and if parents also speak it, when they come home, it's so easy to just fall into that majority language, because the child's home and exhausted from school, and they just want to tell you about their day, in which everything happened in that majority language. So it's a fine line to be like, no, tell me in this language. You just want to hear them. If they have something that they want to tell you, and you want to give them the space to say it.
Yeah, and I run into that with my nephew a lot, because he's 7 now, so he, his language is quite expansive now. And he can say a lot in English, because he goes to school in English, and that's what he learns. And if I speak to him in Polish and he doesn't understand something, he'll just say, like, hey, why don't you just say it in English?
I love the honesty.
Yeah, kids. It'll be faster for us to communicate that way.
Yeah, why are you complicating this?
Yeah,
for sure. All right, so we have listed many things, and we have some more. Do you want to list a couple more, and then I want to recap all these reasons why there might be language attrition?
I want to mention a little more on the stigma of immigrant status, because that's something that is very present still, and it's historically been very present. And then when I worked at the Polish Center, it's a Polish museum, Museum of Polish History and Polish American History. A lot of people that visited, and I would give tours to, and we would chat about most of the people were Polish Americans, and they were second, third, even fourth generation Polish Americans, and virtually none of them spoke Polish, but so many of them, the vast majority, would say that when their parents came or grandparents and they spoke Polish, they didn't want to teach the kids. They said, hey, they won't accept you until you know English. You have to speak English because you have to be American and you have to assimilate, be a part
Mm-hmm.
of the culture. And they just would not teach the kids. And it must have been hard for the parents too, because it's not like they wanted to, in most cases, give up their native language, because it was a huge part
Right.
of their identity. But they said, no, we've come here now, and it's a complete, a 180. Like, we're completely different people now, and that can be very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And virtually all the people that were telling these stories would feel sad about that. They all wish that that was not the case. Like, they all had wished that they were learning Polish when they were kids, and they were learning languages.
Mm-hmm.
And this happens to this day. You hear people like who are unhappy that when
Mm-hmm.
they hear another language, and don't see it as a blessing. So that stigma is very present, and something that we have to speak up, against whenever we
Mm-hmm.
can, especially those of us who are in more privileged positions. Like, I'm in a more privileged position than
Right.
somebody who is struggling with English and is speaking with a thick accent. It'll be harder for them to stand up and say, no, wrong,
Mm-hmm.
um, as opposed to me, who is, who passes for a native, and is, relatively well educated. So I have
Right.
more perceived power in these situations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it almost sounds like it was like a test, like back in the day, like, oh, well, if they hear an accent on you, like they might kick us
Yeah,
out or something, like your status was in
yeah,
jeopardy. It is sad, and I do agree that um, so many people have said, to me, to you, we've all heard it, that, oh, my parents spoke this language, and I really wish they had taught me. And I would say that there's probably zero to very few people that would say, oh, my parents taught me two languages, and I really wish they hadn't.
yes,
So,
yes,
I mean, and even if you've had some attrition and you've lost a lot of skills in one of those languages, I still don't think that you would regret having learned two from a young age, because we all know that kids are like little sponges and they soak it all
yeah,
up, and they're in that sensitive time for language where they're listening, they're repeating, they don't have any sense of shame. That's what's great about little toddlers. They just say what
they
they
will
think.
say it.
But they don't have that, like, not shame, but the like self-awareness that, like, oh, people might judge me if
Yeah,
I say this or do this. So they'll just practice with no filter, and it's
yeah,
amazing.
but
It's amazing to watch
it might
toddlers.
happen
But
once it
yeah.
might happen once they go to school, and it's very important that schools, recognize that, and champion, bilingualism, and understand it.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in, many years ago, when I was in college, I one of my classmates was a substitute teacher, and he was telling me about a school that he, taught at for a little bit, where if you were speaking another language, in between classes, in the hallway, during lunch breaks, they would tell you, you have to speak English. And we're talking about, the US about 10 years ago. We're not talking about 50 years ago.
Wow.
So it's very important that schools recognize that, and champion these, the bilinguals that they have in the schools, um, and
Yes.
parents, and, all of us, we need to, if that's not happening, that's something that we may need to, bring up in school.
Right. Almost like we need to
Yeah,
reclaim it. Like, speaking two languages is not shameful. It shouldn't be stigmatized. It should be something to be celebrated.
yeah,
Almost turning it back on its head. So, we do want to give you some things you can do. But before we do that, just because we kind of spoke at length about all of these reasons, I just want to kind of go through them quickly, just to recap what we've been talking about. So, reasons for attrition could be emigration, which is leaving one's country to move to another, how old you are when you left, So if you reach puberty or not, how ingrained that language is into your brain. Lack of contact with a language, having lexical gaps or missing vocabulary words, taking the path of least resistance, so just speaking whatever language comes to you more easily, which is usually majority language, a perceived language prestige, so believing that one language is more important than another, which is kind of linked to the stigma of immigrants and the desire to assimilate. And let's see, we didn't really talk at length about these, but that people who are adopted either internationally or interculturally. So I read an article that mentioned that most adoptions take place before the age of 2. People want young kids, but even if they happen later, like all the way up to 10, most of those adoptees will lose their first language. So, and they mentioned how the adoptive parents will try and keep up the culture and the language and take trips, but unfortunately, majority language takes over. Refugees we didn't mention, but we talked about moving to another country, but refugees as a specific category often will have a traumatic experience, and they might suppress or abandon or just turn away from their first language if it's related to that experience that they have lived through. So definitely would be a reason why you might lose skills in that language. And the last one I wanted to touch on is that there was a case that a lot of Americans know about with Sergeant Bo Bergdahl. So he was held captive for 5 years by Taliban fighters in Afghanistan. He was 23 when this happened, and of course, he was an English speaker, but when he came back, he had lost some of his language skills. So that made national news, and that was probably the biggest story where we had language attrition in the news in US. All right, did I miss anything?
No, I think you've covered everything. And that was an extreme case.
Very extreme, yeah. So that's not typical.
Yeah.
But I just think it is interesting that it was in the news, that had made headlines.
Yes.
All right, Shet, let's give you some positives, things that you can do. Shall we?
Because this is the more fun part that we'll spend less time on than the less fun part. Right. The big one to start with is to keep your heritage language or your native language, your dormant language active every day. Just very little, even if it's just little things. You want to listen to music and watch TV or videos or shows and listen to podcasts and read books in your native language or your heritage language, and that will help you prevent and slow down the attrition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, we say little things, and a song could be a few minutes, but I do think it takes a little extra effort to even think to do that. It's so easy to just back to that path of least resistance.
Yeah.
Watch whatever's on the regular channels and listen to whatever's on the radio that comes on, when you turn the dial, and not get an app to listen to foreign radio. So I do, and finding the book in the foreign language, it does take a little extra step, or even finding a show. So luckily things like we have YouTube, we can find videos in all languages, but we do sometimes it has an extra cost. Some parents will get magazines or buy books that they have extra costs along with them, but definitely whatever it is you enjoy or whatever it is your children enjoy, try and get their input. And even something as silly as just following someone on social media, if you actually read what they've written in the comments, that can also help.
And so you'll get natives answering that. And in terms of books too, even if you're maintaining a language that is not so high up the prestige ladder, if it's never feel like you can always visit your libraries and they're able to get books in many different languages from other places, and never feel discouraged if the library you visit doesn't have that your language, and definitely feel totally entitled to
Yes.
talk to the librarians about the language you're interested in and you need, because they should do whatever they can to help you get those books. And if they're not, then you can always reference me. You can say that Marcin said you need to do this, and he's a librarian. So
Yep.
yeah, that's
Yeah, use your resources. So libraries are awesome. I don't know about other states, but we have the interlibrary loan, so we can order things from my cell phone from any library in Massachusetts, get it sent to my local library. So I hope other states and countries have things like that. But if not, talk to the librarian. They will do that work on their end. Yes, things are possible. The internet is amazing. So however you can, get your input every day for sure. Another one is trips back to, or not back to, but trips to a country where the language is spoken, or trips back home.
Yeah, I mean, that is research after research, maybe somewhat obviously proves that is pretty much by far the best way to maintain a language is to visit a country or an area where it is spoken broadly, and to go with that, like staying in touch or reconnecting with family members who speak that language and maybe don't speak your majority language or the majority language of where you live. And then pen pals are not as popular maybe as they were 20, 30 years ago, but that is definitely letter writing is definitely a great skill to be sought after and reacquired.
What do you think is like so special about going to the country? Why is that the best?
Well, it's in a way like a two-pronged approach, because on the one hand you are completely immersed, which is the best way to learn and relearn is to just be completely surrounded by it. But I also don't think there is any better motivator than knowing that you will be traveling and going, so you will be super excited to be learning, and the time you spend on reacquiring your language will not feel like a chore. If you if you don't have any plans to travel, it might, after a while it might be more exhausting. But with that,
it's a concrete
it is
goal.
an incredible goal, and you can, I don't see a better way to be motivated to learn or relearn. And like I have a coworker who's a German American. His dad is German, and they grew up speaking a little bit of German, but it wasn't until he decided to spend a semester in Germany and he really picked up the language again. And unlike all the other American students he traveled with, he was taking all German classes because he said, I might as well go all in. And he was able to visit his grandmother and speak with her, and she would teach him, the local dialect, which was not necessarily the German that he learned in classes. And it was and you get to be there every day, and you go outside and you just see the language all over the place.
Yeah, you hear it, you see it. It's just, it's incredible. And good for him for taking all classes in German. Because so many people go abroad and they'll just take as many classes in English as they can. Like, why are you going abroad? But to each their own, to each their own. Another thing you can do, which this whole podcast is about, is have it, the parents using the L1 or whatever that language is. So L1 is a term that we have in our notes that a lot of people reference. So the native language or the first language. But yes, parents keeping the language at home, keeping it alive, has very strong correlations to language maintenance. And there are many studies. There's lots of people who do research on minority language maintenance or heritage language maintenance. So you'll hear those two terms. So heritage speakers are usually relating to children who are in school, but people who speak a language at home that's different than the community language.
Yeah.
So parents, keep doing what you're doing.
And also
We see
we
you.
can say,
It's
like,
awesome.
the maybe almost the last one is when we talked about the path of least resistance, we said like, oh, we say some things in the language we're not as comfortable with, and then shift back to the more comfortable language. But it's still, you're still using that. So mode mixing is both a factor for maintenance
Hmm.
and attrition, because if you were to completely switch to the majority language that you're more comfortable with and not use your other language at all, lose it
Hmm.
more completely. But if you switch back and forth, it's not as exhausting for your brain, and you get some of that practice in. So um, yeah, when your children want to switch back to, English for us, once in a while, then that's perfectly okay.
Hmm. Yes, code switching is completely normal. A lot of parents worry that their kid is confused, or they're not learning properly, or this is just not working. We should stop speaking this other language. We should focus on the majority language. But it is completely normal for kids, for teenagers, for adults. I think we all have done. If you speak two languages, you've definitely code switched. Well, if you have another bilingual speaker who speaks those two languages with you, otherwise it wouldn't make sense to code switch. But yeah, it's definitely a balancing act, trying to maintain all of your languages so that you don't lose your skills that you've worked hard to build. You don't, especially if it's your native tongue, because there's so much of your identity. And I think the longer you study a language, of the more of your identity gets wrapped up in being a speaker of that language. Um, so that's where all the emotions can come into this. But the last thing we wanted to say is about school. So if you can find a bilingual school or an immersion program, or even the Saturday schools that a lot of people have for heritage language speakers, just a place that is going to put, the emphasis that this is important. Speaking this language is important, because a lot of times in public schools, unfortunately, it's just another class. So it's not
Yeah,
really,
and it's
the emphasis is
and
not
it's
there.
very often an elective and not a requirement.
Yes, yes, that is true.
And
First things to be cut. A lot of French programs, unfortunately, have been cut
yes,
because they're just, yeah, not seen as important.
yeah, unfortunately, but and
Yes.
the other thing about finding bilingual schools or Saturday classes for your kids is that it's one thing for them to hear adults speak the language, but it's when they hear other kids speak it, that's when they will really pick it up and not switch to the majority language if other kids are speaking
That is so true.
their native language or their heritage
Yeah.
language. Try to
Hmm.
find groups
Yeah, that is.
of other like-minded parents and have your kids interact in that language.
Yes, when it is safe to have playgroups, you should definitely get all the speakers together that you can and have a playgroup. Because yeah, kids are going to learn so much more from each other. They're obviously listening to us and repeating and doing what we do, but they're going to have much more fun. And kids learn through play, so kids speaking the language together is definitely ideal. Especially, if you can't make that trip, find some kids in the neighborhood in your area around that can travel maybe half an
Yeah.
hour and have a play group.
Are you enjoying this podcast or this episode in particular? If so, please consider sharing it with a friend that you know would enjoy it, or sharing it on your social media feed. If you do share on Instagram, please use the hashtag #TheFutureIsBilingual so I can see what you've shared. We really appreciate your support. Also, please consider leaving a review at the website ratethispodcast.com/bilingual. I'll leave a link in the show notes for you. Thank you.
So to help prevent the loss of language and to help stop language attrition, you want to engage with your dormant language or your heritage language every day. If you can, you want to take all the trips, and if not, find speakers of the same language and form groups and sign up for bilingual schools or Saturday classes, and advocate for your schools to be champions of bilingualism, and remember that code mixing is okay, and let your kids have fun. and those will help you.
Yeah.
Those will help you with maintenance of your language.
Wonderful. Yes. So make it fun, make it enjoyable, right? It shouldn't feel like a chore or a pain, especially when we're trying to pass it on to kids.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming on and hosting with me.
Yeah.
It's been fun.
Yeah.
Much more fun than talking to myself.
Yeah. And I hope that the listeners learned some new things and enjoyed the this format.
Yes. So please let us know if you have any comments or suggestions. You can email at tfib, so that stands for The Future is Bilingual. So tfibpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram at The Future is Bilingual. No spaces, no dots. And yeah, we look forward to hearing from you, and we look forward to making some more episodes.
All right.
Okay. Thanks,
Bye.
Marcin. Take care.